Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. I was on the board of the African Humanities Institute at Northwestern for a while. I used to come here in January. That shows you how devoted I was. Actually, I'm going to talk a bit about my family as a context for my cosmopolitanism. So, I'm going to begin with my English mother, who was born in the Cotswolds, to a family that traced its ancestry within a 30-mile radius back to the Norman period, something like close to a millennium ago. This is the church where she was christened, which is a walking distance from my grandfather's house, and this is the church nearby in the town of Cirencester, where many of her ancestors are buried back to the 12th century. My Ghanaian father, on the other hand, was born in Kumasi, the capital of the Ashanti region of what was then the British Gold Coast colony, and he traced his ancestry back over several centuries, back to around the beginnings of the Ashanti kingdom at the turn of the 18th century. This is the turn of the 19th century, but I don't have any 18th century pictures of Ashanti. So when these two people, born so far apart, married in the 1950s in England, many people warned them that their mixed marriage was going to be difficult. And my parents agreed because my father was a Methodist and my mother was an Anglican. After all, as Anglicans like to point out, John Wesley, founding father of Methodism, for those of you who don't know about these things, once said, "If the Methodists leave the Church of England, I fear that God will leave the Methodists." So I'm a product of a mixed marriage, baptized a Methodist in Ghana at this church, educated in England at these schools. I went to Sunday school regularly at a church called St. George's, of which this was my mother's church. She was a member of it and an elder of it for more than 50 years, most of the time she spent in Ghana after moving there, after she married my father. So I'm a child not just of my mother, but also of St. George's. And I learned Christianity and its moral ideas from both of them, both from my parents and from this church. But I also learned something from both my parents, something that they had exemplified when they decided to become man and wife, and that was a kind of openness to people and cultures beyond the ones they were raised in, an openness that carried them through together, despite all the 1950s doom-saying about mixed marriages, along with a bit of love and luck and patience, no doubt, till death did them part. My mother learned this openness, I think, in part from her own parents. This is my grandfather with some of his non-English friends. And they had friends in many continents at a time when it was normal for English people of the upper middle classes as they were to be somewhat provincial. My father, this is my father at home in the house I grew up in, learned his cosmopolitanism, I think, as much as anything else from Kumasi, that city I showed you, which, like many old capital cities, is a multilingual place, multicultural place, and has long been open to the world. The market that I showed you was, for a long time, the largest market in West Africa, so it was a center of commerce over a large region. But I think my father learned it too from his schooling, because like many of those who had the carefully doled out opportunity for a proper secondary education in the far-flung reaches of the British Empire, he was educated in the classics. My father loved his Latin. By his bedside, he kept not only his Bible, but the works of Cicero and Marcus Aurelius, followers of the sort of Stoicism that was central to the intellectual and moral life of the Roman Empire by the first century when Christianity was beginning to spread. In his spiritual testament to us, his children, he told us that we should always remember that we were citizens of the world. He used those exact words. Words that, of course, Marcus Aurelius would have recognized and agreed with. Marcus Aurelius, who, after all, wrote, "How close is the kinship between a man and all of humanity, for it is a community not of a little blood or seed, but of the Spirit." I was told to check that everybody could hear me at some point after I'd begun. Can everybody in the back hear me? Good. My mother's commitments were more literary than philosophical. Her first vocation had been as a painter, This is a painting that she did of herself. And each of her 4 children has a painting or 2 of hers hanging at home today. Not only could she draw beautifully with her hands, she could do it with her feet, a fact that produced much pleasure for us at our children's childhood birthday parties. I asked her once why she had stopped painting in view of this fact, and her unsentimental response was, "You were born." Since we had a perfectly normal relationship between mother and son, this was not the only time she made me feel extremely guilty. So her second vocation as a writer was something she apparently found easier to fit into her new life as a mother. She began her literary career with books that aimed to make the lives of people in Asante, where we were, accessible to children in the rest of the English-speaking world. The first of them was called Anansi the Spider. It's published by Pantheon, and it was subtitled Tales of an Asante Father. And it was based on the retelling of Asante folktales that my sister and I had learned as children from our own father, and which my mother had learned when she overheard her husband telling them to her children. So she then went on to write stories about contemporary children in Ghana, and finally to write novels about adult Ghanaian life. So her other job when I was a child was to run the office of a lawyer and politician, since my father practiced law and was a member of the first parliament after Ghanaian independence. She'd grown up in the household of another parliamentarian. Her own father and grandfather and a couple of her great-uncles and some of her cousins were members of the British Parliament, and so in some respects she had a good idea of what it would mean to be a politician's wife, since that was what her mother had been. But her experience in England hadn't prepared her for one aspect of the life of an opposition member of parliament in the early years after independence in Ghana, which she had to deal with when the president decided, when I was about 7, that he would lock up some of his political opponents without bothering with the formality of a trial. This is a picture of that president with my parents in happier times. As a result, my father found herself having to look after her family and try to seek support for an imprisoned husband in a country where she was a stranger. In that difficult period, my mother, my sisters, and I learned a couple of important lessons. And one was this, that when the government threatens you, you don't know where you will find your friends. Many ordinary people whom we didn't know at all sent us their gifts and their good wishes. Many people we thought were our friends disappeared. I'm glad to say that one great source of solace throughout that time was my father's extended family, and another was my mother's church, St. George's. But a second thing we learned was that my father's view that we were citizens of the world was shared by many people in other countries who heard about what had happened to us and who wrote to their governments and to our government demanding that my father and his friends be released. If you haven't had the experience, which I don't recommend, it's probably hard to appreciate how uplifting it is when your father is imprisoned and your family is threatened with deportation from the only country you have known, to discover that all around the world, in Australia, in other parts of Africa, in Britain and North America, there are people who are on your side. These people thought of us as their fellows, even though we were not citizens of the same country. They treated us as fellow citizens of a human community. And there's a very simple explanation for how this happened. We were lucky. Amnesty International had just been founded when my father was arrested, and their first mission, the first mission of Amnesty International, was to Ghana, and it was Amnesty that organized that support from around the world, because my father was one of what came to be called one of Amnesty's prisoners of conscience. So these experiences are part of the reason that I have been so committed to the related work of the PEN American Center, whose president I had the honor of being for some years a few years ago, working in collaboration with 145 PEN centers around the world in more than 100 countries. Because PEN, like Amnesty, was founded on the principle that building links across nations is one way to build the possibility of peace between nations. The first PEN Club was founded in London in 1921 with John Galsworthy as its first president. Its first members included Other novelists, poets, essayists, and playwrights, among them Joseph Conrad, George Bernard Shaw, and H.G. Wells, they were all inspired by a woman by the name of Catherine Amy Dawson Scott, a British poet and playwright. The first poem of her 1912 anthology, Beyond, starts like this. Behind the trees, a slender moon rose in the quiet sky. Clear gold in the grey night, she passed the leafless branches by. So it's probably a good thing that pen is her best remembered creation. So these writers came together in the shadow of the First World War in response to the threats to civilization and to human decency posed by the slaughter on the battlefields of Europe. Galsworthy spoke at the first dinner of a League of Nations for men and women of letters. Their aim was to build international literary fellowship and, as they said, quote, to defend literature against the many threats to its survival which the modern world poses. And they were inspired by the idea that if the writers of all nations could build links of friendship through their shared concern for literature, the nations of which they were citizens could come closer to friendship too. A year later, the PEN American Center came into being, and over the years, many of our leading literary lights have been members. James Baldwin, Willa Cather, Robert Frost, Langston Hughes, Thomas Mann, John Steinbeck, Arthur Miller, Marianne Moore, Susan Sontag, Paul Auster, Salman Rushdie. Since 1960, International PEN's Writers in Prison Committee, based in London, has worked on behalf of persecuted writers worldwide, alongside our Freedom to Write Committee in New York, which was the organization that brought me into PEN in the first place. Joseph Brodsky, Wolosheenka, Václav Havel, José Revueltas, Pramodia Anantatoer, Alicia Portnoy, along with Salman Rushdie and Orhan Pamuk and Tlisma Nasreen, are among the hundreds of writers PEN has helped to free or sought to free and sometimes succeeded in freeing from prison over the years. And it's perhaps worth pointing out that these 9 writers were born in 9 states, only 3 of which still exist. They were born in the Soviet Union, which doesn't exist anymore. They were born in the colony and protectorate of Nigeria, which is now an independent state. They were born in Czechoslovakia, which is no longer there. Mexico, which is still there. The Dutch East Indies, which is no longer Dutch. Argentina, British India, no longer British. Turkey, and East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. In a time with so many political transitions, it's not too surprising that writers have found their lives swept up in politics. Both as a son of a writer mother and a father who was a political prisoner 3 times eventually, but that's a different story, and as the child of parents who believed passionately in world citizenship and at the same time in patriotic devotion to the country where they lived, I was fated to be impassioned by the work of an organization that has, at its heart, working to protect free expression everywhere, in part by campaigning for the freedom of writers imprisoned for what they have written. But if my commitments were merely personal, rooted only in my own particular history, I couldn't recommend them to people whose experiences are different from mine. So I want today to argue for 2 ideas that together offer every human being a reason to care about the sort of work PEN does. The first is that ideal of world citizenship that I learned from my parents. And the second is the importance of free expression, not just in journalism and political writing, but also in the life of the imagination. And let me start with world citizenship. The idea of world citizenship has a long history in Western philosophy, as I'm sure you know. The grand name for this is cosmopolitanism, a word whose etymology is Greek, even though the man who probably coined it came, like many of the traditions of the West, from Asia Minor. And it's worth insisting that this idea and the related ideas of universal brotherhood and sisterhood were independently invented in other continents and at other times. But the earliest figure that I know of who said he was a citizen of the world, cosmopolites in Greek, which is where the word comes from, was the philosopher Diogenes. He was the founder of the philosophical movement, later called Cynicism, not to be confused with the official ideology of the American high school. And he was born sometime in the late 5th century in a place called Sinope on the northern coast of what's now Turkey. The Cynics rejected traditions and local loyalties and generally opposed what everybody else thought of as civilized behavior. Diogenes himself lived, tradition reports, in a large terracotta pot. It is said that he carried out in public most of those bodily functions most of us think we should keep to ourselves. So he was a sort of 4th century BCE performance artist. And he was called a cynic, kynikos in Greek means doggy or dog-like, because he lived like a dog. He did those things in public that humans do in private. And so you could say that the cynics are just the doggy philosophers, and you won't be surprised to hear that he was kicked out of Sinope. But for better or worse, he's the first person who's reported to have said that he was a citizen of the world in the West. Now, this is a metaphor, of course, because citizens share a state, and there was no world state. There wasn't a cosmopolis for Diogenes to be a citizen of. So like anyone who adopts this metaphor, he had to decide what to make it mean. One thing he didn't mean was that he favored a single world government. Diogenes once met someone who did believe in a single world government, a fellow by the name of Alexander of Macedon, Alexander the Great, who believed, as you know, in government of the world by Alexander of Macedon, and almost achieved it, though he only lived to be 33, unlike Diogenes, who lived to be well over 90. The story goes that Alexander came across Diogenes one sunny day, this time not inside the terracotta pot, but basking in the sun. The Macedonian world conqueror, who, as Aristotle's student, had been brought up to respect philosophers, asked Diogenes if there was anything he could do for him, and Diogenes' famous reply was, "Sure, you can get out of my light." So Diogenes was apparently not a fan of Alexander's, or, as we may suppose, of his project of global domination. And I often wonder what Alexander would have thought about this, because one of Alexander's sayings that has come down to us is, if I hadn't been Alexander, I would have liked to have been Diogenes. It must have been a bit disappointing for someone who thought that when he met Diogenes and all Diogenes wanted from him was that he should get out of his light. So the first thing I'd like to take from Diogenes in interpreting the metaphor of global citizenship is that we don't need world government, not even by one of Aristotle's students. We can think of ourselves, Diogenes wanted to say, as fellow citizens, even if we aren't and don't want to be members of a literal single political community subject to a single literal government. A second idea we can take from Diogenes is that we should care about the fate of all our fellow human beings, however, not just the ones in our own literal political community. Just as within your community you should care about every one of your fellow citizens, so in the world as a whole you should care for your fellow world citizens, the other humans. And furthermore, this is the third idea we can borrow, that we can take from Diogenes, we can borrow good ideas from all over the world, not just from our own society. It's worth listening to others because they may have something to teach us, and it's worth their while listening to us because they may have something to learn. Now, we don't have writings from Diogenes, partly, I suspect, because, like Socrates, he thought that conversation, which goes both ways and in which you can learn as well as teach, is a better way of communicating than writing messages to people who can't answer back, which is what Plato did in his dialogues. That's a final thing I want to borrow from Diogenes, the idea of dialogue, of conversation, as one of the things that's fundamental to human life, one of the fundamental forms of human interaction. So these three ideas, I, a 21st century American citizen of Anglo-Ghanaian ancestry, want to borrow from a citizen of the polis of Sinope who dreamed of global citizenship 24 centuries ago. 1, we don't need a single world government, but 2, we must care for the fate of all human beings, whether they're inside or outside our own societies, and 3, we have much to gain from our conversations with one another across our many differences. Now, that's the ideal of cosmopolitanism, and globalization has made this great ideal relevant, which it really wasn't in the days of Diogenes or Marcus Aurelius. Because there are two obvious conditions on shared citizenship, on making it real, knowledge about the lives of our fellow citizens, the others, on the one hand, and the power to affect them on the other. And Diogenes didn't know about most people in China and Japan, in South Africa, South America, in Equatorial Africa, even in Western or Northern Europe. And nothing he did was likely to have much impact on them, as far as he knew, either. And so you can't give real meaning to the idea that we're all fellow citizens unless we can affect each other and unless we can know about each other. But it's obvious that we no longer live in Diogenes' world in that respect, because in the last few centuries we've all come gradually to be drawn into a single web of trade and a global network of information, and we've come to a point where we can realistically imagine contacting any other of the billions of our fellow humans and sending her something worth having. A cell phone or an antibiotic or a good idea. And of course, we can also send, through negligence as easily as malice, things that will cause harm. A virus, or a pollutant in the air, or a bad idea. And the possibilities of good and ill are multiplied when it comes to politics and where things are done by governments in our name. Together, we can ruin poor farmers in poor countries by dumping our subsidized grain into their markets. We can cripple industries with punitive tariffs, and we can deliver weapons that can kill thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, potentially millions. But also together, we can raise standards of living by adopting wise policies on trade and aid, prevent or treat diseases with vaccines and pharmaceuticals, take measures against global climate change, and encourage resistance to tyranny and a concern for the worth of each human life. So, the existence of global media means we can now know about one another, and global interconnections, economic, politically, military, ecological, mean we can, indeed we inevitably will, affect one another. So now we really need a cosmopolitan spirit. It was just invented 2.5 millennia too early. That spirit thinks of us as bound together across the species, but also accepts that we will make our different choices within and across nations about how to make our lives. And so the challenge is to take minds formed over the long millennia of living in little groups, local groups, and equip us with ideas and institutions that will allow us to live as the global tribe we have, in a certain sense, become. But I want to begin by underlining the way that cosmopolitanism is a double-stranded tradition. Both of these parts are important. It's universality, but also difference. And I want to say something about why cosmopolitans accept, indeed celebrate, the wide range of legitimate human diversity. Why, after all, shouldn't we do, in the name of universal concern, in the name of universality, what missionaries of many faiths have done? Why shouldn't we go out into the world, guided by the truth, and help others to live by it too? Well, one reason that a cosmopolitan will give you is one that is inherited from the Greek philosophical tradition, which is a recognition of the fallibility of all human claims to knowledge. So we begin with the philosophical doctrine of fallibilism. We know that the things we think we know, we may be wrong about. It's not that we don't take our own views seriously, but we're always open to the possibility that it may turn out that we've got things wrong. And if I'm wrong about something, maybe I can learn from others, especially despite the fact that they will be wrong about other things from which they may be able to learn from me. So that's one reason, fallibility. The second reason, whose roots are in a more modern idea, is this. Human individuals are charged with ultimate responsibility for their own lives. The dignity of human beings resides in part in our capacity for, and our right to, the management of our own lives. And because of this, it's important that human beings live by standards that they themselves believe in. But because cosmopolitanism is fallibilist, the conversation across culture and politics and society and economics and religious boundaries is not about wholesale conversion. It's about learning as well as teaching, and it's about listening as well as talking. So even when I'm trying to persuade someone that what they see as right is wrong, I'm also hearing their arguments that what I think is wrong is right. Now, global conversation is a metaphor. It needs interpretation, just as the metaphor of global citizenship needs interpreting, because, of course, you and I can't literally converse with the other 7.25 billion strangers who inhabit the planet. The mathematicians in the room will tell you how many conversations it would take for that to happen. But a global community of cosmopolitans will consist of people who want to learn about other ways of life, not just through travel, but also through anthropology and history, through novels and movies, through news stories in newspapers, on radio and television, and so on. But in remaining open to the global, the cosmopolitanism I'm trying to endorse does not require you to abandon the local, far from it. There's a striking passage to this point in George Eliot's Daniel Deronda. This is the front of the first edition of Daniel Deronda in 1876, I think. Which was the year, as it happens, when England's first and so far last Jewish Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, entered the House of Lords as Earl of Beaconsfield. Disraeli, though baptized and brought up in the Church of England, always had a proud consciousness of his Jewish ancestry, which, given his name, it would have been hard to ignore. His name was Disraeli. But Deronda, who had been raised in England as a Christian gentleman, discovers his Jewish ancestry only as an adult. And his response is to commit himself, as he says, to the furtherance of his hereditary people. Here's the passage from Daniel Deronda. It was as if he had found an added soul in finding his ancestry, his judgment no longer wandering in the mazes of impartial sympathy, but choosing with the noble partiality which is man's best strength, the closer fellowship that makes sympathy practical, exchanging that bird's-eye reasonableness which soars to avoid preference and loses all sense of quality for the generous reasonableness of drawing shoulder to shoulder with men of like inheritance. Now notice that in claiming a Jewish identity, a Jewish loyalty, an added soul, Deronda is not rejecting his loyalty to humanity. Eliot's talk of the closer fellowship that makes sympathy practical echoes a claim that was already made long ago by Cicero, that society and human fellowship will best be served if we confer the most kindness on those with whom we are most closely associated. So the austere creed, the austere form of universalism that disdains our partiality to kith and kin, has an interesting past, but it has no future. Cosmopolitanism begins with a respect for roots, which is one reason I was happy to begin by telling you something of the places in England and in Ghana that produced the cosmopolitan who stands before you today. I said I wanted to defend two ideas. That's the defense of cosmopolitanism. The second thing I wanted to say was how important literature is in that, in our lives and in that cosmopolitan adventure. And I hope I've already persuaded you of that in part just by showing you, by looking at this passage from Deronda, that it's always there in our reading of literature, this possibility of being extended as well as being brought home. I think that if you care about freedom, if you care about literature, you must also care, as American Pen does, as the Pen system does, about freedom of expression. And you must care about it at home as well as abroad. And what I'd like to do now, in closing, is just to tell you one story about one person in relation to this project, this global project of defending literary freedom, the freedom of literature. So I'm going to have to skip some slides here, so you will be able quickly to see the things that I'm not talking about. Very exciting. On Christmas Day 2009, this man, Liu Xiaobo, writer, human rights activist, and former president of the independent Chinese Pen Center, our collaborating organization, one of the Chinese members of the international Pen family, was sentenced to 11 years in prison in China for, as the court said, 7 published sentences, 224 Chinese characters. In their official verdict, the Beijing court cited these exact passages from his writings that were alleged to be subversive. 2 of the sentences come from Charter 08, a manifesto calling for democratic reforms in China, a manifesto he helped to write, and which has been signed by thousands of other brave Chinese men and women, and was created 31 years after Charter 77, the Czech Charter of Freedoms, initiated by Václav Havel, which was one of the key moments in the movement towards freedom in Europe. So what did we do? What does it mean in practice to think of yourself as Liu Xiaobo's fellow citizen of the world? Well, the first thing we did was we brought together writers on the steps of the New York Public Library. It was snowing at the time, so we brought ourselves together in the snow. But that won't surprise you in Chicago. You must have to do that all the time. To protest and to read out translations of those 224 characters, to take a letter to the Chinese mission to the United Nations, to ask our ambassador in Beijing to speak to the Chinese government on his behalf, to talk on television to CNN International in Hong Kong, which is broadcast into China, and to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize, to send a colleague to visit his wife, to ask our own president to take the matter up in his meetings with the Chinese, and to keep writing to the president of China about him ourselves. So we want them to know that he will not be forgotten, that we won't forget him. We want them to see that his case will be a constant irritation in their relations with the United States and the many other countries from which PEN centers have written to China about Liu Xiaobo. And we care about this because we care about China's great literary traditions and China's voice. We want China to be heard in the community of nations. So it's important to us writers, that Liu is not just a human rights activist, but also a poet. And because his voice is silenced at home, we outside must speak his words for him. And I want to read you the final I'll put up the whole poem, and I'm just going to read you the final few lines of his poem Daybreak, which he wrote in prison nearly 15 years ago, in a translation by Jeffrey Yang, a fine American poet. It's dedicated to his wife, Liu Jia, and it ends with these heartbreaking words. Daybreak, a vast emptiness, you in a far place, with nights of love stored away. As my friend and PEN colleague Ed Doctorow said about our demonstration on the steps of the New York Public Library, here he is with some of the other writers, Edward Albee, so on. Such events as this have been necessary for as long as I can remember. PEN members marched around the Czech embassy to protest the jailing of Václav Havel. 20 years ago, we rose in judgment against the fatwa applied to Salman Rushdie. The attack is always directed to the creative mind. In the years since Liu Xiaobo's incarceration, the global PEN community, including the independent Chinese PEN Center, has sought to keep his case before a Chinese and an international audience, as I'm doing here today. And we all have to keep working to get him and the many other prisoners of conscience in China their freedom, since things have unfortunately gotten much worse for free expression there since he won the prize. I began with the story of how my own commitment to the idea that there's a special role for the literary community in our cosmopolitan conversation had roots in my own life. But each of us will come to our own cosmopolitan engagements, if we do, out of our own lives. I hope I've begun to make the case for cosmopolitan engagement and for cosmopolitan literary engagement in particular, engagement with the lives of other societies wherever you started out. In the course of exploring these ideas, I brought together a Greek from 2.5 millennia ago and writers from a score of other nations. They are writers we profit from reading wherever we come from, wherever they come from, as many of you already have, and we profit from reading them even if we don't know or care about the political struggles that have washed over them. But reading them is already to claim them as fellow citizens of the global republic of letters, of Galsworthy's League of Nations for Men and Women of Letters. And once you've done that, it seems natural that you should care also about what happens in the nations they come from, not just in your own. Literature translates us across societies. That's why there's always been an intimate connection between literature and cosmopolitanism. The work of the global PEN community is, I believe, a powerful example of what it means, not in theory but in practice, to conceive of ourselves as global citizens. The life of the imagination, the writer's life, depends upon crossing boundaries. And we cosmopolitans believe that there's a magic power in crossing boundaries wherever you live and whatever your vocation. Thank you very much.
Okay, so you told about Diogenes as a performer, and I would like to have your opinion about current performer called Pyotr Pavlensky. It's, you know, probably the Russian guy. In protest to Putin politics, he nailed his boss on Red Square and sit there before he was taken to the ambulance. And this is two opinions about this. That this is very high art in this time that you cannot emphasize yourself otherwise. All this is just very stupid. What is your opinion about this particular?
Well, I don't think it's ever stupid to make powerful claims against a government that is doing things that are, or a governor that's doing things that are wrong. And one of the striking things about much artistic intervention in the space of politics is that it's always possible to, there's always an act of interpretation involved. It's always possible to see things as either stupid or as powerful expressions of an argument. And because if you do something that's sort of literal-minded, there's only one interpretation, but it's less interesting, less exciting, less the sort of thing we expect of our artists and creators. So, I mean, I ran out of time. I did actually have a section in the Senate. They say, what is it? I claim the right to revise and extend my remarks. So I did have a fairly extensive discussion of the problem of press freedom in Russia at the moment. And I care about it for the same reasons as I care about Liu Xiaobo. I want to know I want Russians, of course, to know what's going on in Russia. I want Chinese to know what's going on in China. But I want all of us to know what's going on in Russia because we are part of an interconnected community of people. We can't, we need Russia as a democratic society in the fellowship of the democracies. But it can't be a democracy in the right way if it doesn't have freedom of expression, if it doesn't have a press that allows people to know the things that are, let's put it mildly, controversial, that President Putin does. So that's one, again, this is back to the argument, the importance of freedom is connected with the importance of literature. We need to hear these voices. Russians need to be able to hear these voices. And we need a Russia in which these voices can be heard, because only a Russia in which these voices can be heard can be a really positive partner for us in the community of democratic nations. Mutatis mutandis, I just said the same thing about China. So yes. In fact, it's a perfect case of what I'm thinking about.
Hi, I have a short question. Well, not short question, actually, pretty extended question now. The most chances that we get in touch with literature in the modern age is from medias, newspapers and websites talking about news. But it seems that the media has a certain interest or favor among the voices that it wants to exemplify. And often it seems that the mainstream media have ignored part of the news that they have auto-censored themselves, especially when, even in the West, we see medias that they reiterate what they hear from, the media is presented by countries that's not democratic, which means it's a government's voice. And by repeating that voice, it doesn't really provide the media justice that we expect. So in your professional opinion, I would want to hear how can literature play a more powerful role on media on that aspect?
Good. So,
I
mean, it's in the world of PEN, in the world of this International Literary Fellowship, we have an ongoing debate about the relationship between the classical forms of censorship, which are state action to prohibit the distribution of printed text, basically, on the one hand, and other forms of interference with free expression that are either not done by the state or are done in other ways than by stopping the printing of things or closing down websites. So one way a government can interfere with the flow of ideas is by crowding out with noise all the dissident voices. You don't need to shut the dissident voices up if you fill all the public space with your own noise. Similarly, even if the government isn't doing it, even if you have protections against government censorship, an active and vibrant democracy depends upon citizens knowing what's going on, and they can fail to know what's going on not because the government is stopping them, but because it's too hard for them to find out given the media environment in which they live. Even in a country like this, where it's very unusual, though not unheard of, for the government to engage in stopping the expression of ideas, the question whether most citizens, who after all have lives to live in which they have other things to be doing, can get access to the sort of information they need in order to make the important decisions that we're going to be making next Tuesday when we vote, for example, though voting is only one of the duties of citizenship. Whether we have that information, I think, available to us in the form that we can use, I think it may not be available to us, and it may not be available to us for reasons that have nothing to do with what the government is doing. So then there's a place for all kinds of creativity. The kind of creativity that would naturally be displayed in a museum like this, the creativity of artists who make things, and videos and paintings and sculptures and other forms of plastic art and so on, but also the creativity of journalists who find ways to get ideas into the public world in a way that gets through the noise and gets over the hurdles set by the many, many agendas that shape what's available to us. We have a tool available to us now, which we're just learning how to use, I think, in the internet. We have, in that world, a tool that raises the difficulty for crowding out by direct suppression by the government, but doesn't yet, I think, guarantee us that we'll be creating a vibrant public sphere in which people are talking about the things that we need to be talking about, for two reasons. One reason is that the challenge of the internet is that it's not a public. It's a series of little worlds of its own, and they're not necessarily very much in dialogue with each other. 50 years ago in this country, in the now much disparaged mainstream media, the MSM, there were a few voices, and there was a kind of consensus upon, roughly speaking, what the news of the day was, and you could have different views about it, perhaps not wide enough range of views about it. Perhaps we should have had a wider left, and maybe we didn't, but still, there was a range of views, but there was a kind of consensus on what, as it were, what the facts were. We don't have that anymore, and we have it less and less, and one of the reasons is that we've got technologies that allow you to create little spaces in which people can echo the ideas of some group, and people can find it satisfying just to live in a world like that, and then go out into the world and vote as if that was the whole world, as if their little world of... And this is a problem across the political spectrum. This is not a problem of the right, it's not a problem of the left, it's a problem in the center as well, actually, that people in the center, many of us couldn't give a good account of what it is that the citizens we don't agree with are actually thinking. We have caricatural views. When people say to a lot of the people that I hang out with, when people say, oh, evangelical Christian, which is, in my context, often meant to be a way of preparing you for saying that someone said something silly, I want to say, that's 40% of our population. Probably at least a third of them vote for the Democratic Party. They don't all agree about lots of things. They just agree that they fit whatever your definition is of an evangelical Christian, and that's a topic that's itself a matter of much dispute among people who call themselves evangelical Christians. And the same is true unfortunately, about many evangelical Christians. They don't know much about the secular humanists. that they disparage. They don't know much about how they think about things. They think, for example, that secular humanists have a difficulty being morally serious because they think you can't be morally serious if you're not religious. So we have all these separate spheres, and I think that this is one of the great challenges, imaginative challenges of our time. A challenge for our writers and our artists is to help us deal with this incapacity to create a shared sense of the public.
Last question.
Thank you so much. It's really inspirational. I'm so intrigued by your argument that we need to be properly rooted in order to be real and genuine cosmopolitans. So I'm wondering about the reverse. Do we need to be cosmopolitans to be better rooted citizens? And I'm thinking very locally here. I mean, you know, we have in Chicago an ongoing important debate of what does it mean to be a citizen in this great city and with all its problems, with all its great things. How can a cosmopolitan agenda change the way we can be better local citizens? How do you see that relationship?
So that's a very, I mean, it's a big topic and it's an important topic, and it is really important to make both the points. The point that I was stressing today, which is the fact that a cosmopolitan agenda I think, has to be rooted. Look, there's a simple way of putting it. It's universality plus difference. I can't argue for the importance of the different perspectives of other people if I don't think that the difference that I represent matters too. That would be incoherent. So if part of cosmopolitanism is valuing localities, it would be absurd to value all the other localities and exclude your own. And in fact, I think a reasonable cosmopolitanism is consistent with what philosophers call partiality to one's own, that is to say, a greater focus on the local than on the cosmopolitan. But there are many, and now let me just talk about cities in particular in this question, because I think this is a really interesting and perhaps new phenomenon, which is that some of the great problems that we face in the world today, let's take in the environment, the problems of climate change and so on, the nation states are doing a pretty bad job of coming to the agreements that are necessary to solve them. But some progress is being made, and it's being made by collaborations among cities. And this is a point that Benjamin Barber's been making in recent publishing of his, but it's a really important point. One of the reasons is that if you live in cities, there's a kind of set of problems that arise from environmental pollution and from climate change that are urgent and visible to you in a way that they might not be to everybody in your country. If you live in Beijing and you're dealing with you need a face mask many days, or at least you look on the news in the morning to see whether it's safe to go out and breathe, and of course that can be a problem in many parts of China now, but it's an intense problem in the cities. So the cities have a reason to focus on it, and they have a reason to focus on it with other cities, because if the megacities of the world together reduced their pollution significantly, that would actually be an enormous contribution to solving the problem of the planet. So they're collaborating city to city because they care about their own cities, but also because they can see that, as cosmopolitans, other people's cities matter too, and indeed that we can't solve the problem unless we work it all out together. So I think there are many examples like this where the best chance of solving the local problem turns out to be a kind of cosmopolitan collaboration. Notice that this is exactly the kind of cosmopolitan collaboration you would predict if you shared with Diogenes the view that we can be global citizens without sharing a global government. Because this is the coordination of citizens across democratic societies, or actually across societies, democratic or not. It's the coordination of citizens without insisting that you have to have a global Washington in order to do the coordination. That there are some things that are urgent and that we, as Chicagoans and Beijingers and Shanghaiers and Bombayers and Sao Pauloers can do together as proud citizens of those cities that will help solve our problem, but will also help solve the problem for the planet.